flying 260 miles over central China.
You are looking live as we prepare for the return of Boeing's Starliner. Live coverage of the spacecraft's return coming your way in just moments as NASA re-racks this launch video, which I will welcome in my co-host for the evening, Joseph Niven in Greensboro, North Carolina. Joseph, you remember when we watched this launch, we thought they were only going up for about a week or so, and how far we've come as now we prepare for Starliner to return back to Earth without them. How are you doing tonight, Joseph?
I'm doing very good. How are you?
You know, I think we're doing as best as we can be as we begin this live coverage on the Carolina Weather Group of the return of Boeing's Starliner, a mission that was intended to showcase Boeing's strengths and abilities to bring astronauts to the International Space Station as part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program and human spaceflight. But Joseph, as we know, Boeing has been long trying to compete with SpaceX, who's been in this game for several years now, and Boeing's just been plagued with some problems that has resulted in NASA deciding to keep their two astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Give us the brief summary, if you will, Joseph, as to what type of problems they've seen lately for anyone who maybe has been under a rock.
Yeah, I mean, Starliner, the Starliner program, the first off has had multiple. This is the third flight of Starliner, and each one has had some problem of some sort. So it's nothing new to have something come up. And in all fairness, all space flights have something come up. Even SpaceX does, but they don't always make it widely available. But in this case, they took off a couple months ago, early summer, and they had before launch they had delayed it because they had a helium leak, and helium leaks aren't always a problem. I mean, it sounds concerning, but the space shuttle had leaks. But within tolerances, within certain margins that, like an aircraft, they can sometimes defer maintenance on aircraft and fly it if it's been checked and it's fairly obvious. And they delayed it, and they looked at the data before launch, and Boeing and NASA jointly decided that they would push on to launch at a later date. And then when they did launch, they noticed some problems with thrusters and while on orbit. And then they didn't know exactly what the problem was with the thrusters. So that's why after docking, they stayed on the space station, which isn't necessarily a problem. But they just wanted to see if they could get any data that would make sure it's checked out and ready to come back home. But unfortunately, this part of the spacecraft that has the thrusters is on a service module behind. I can show you actually. So this the Starliner has a main capsule, and it's docked to the station when it was like this. And the thrusters that are in question are right there, and they're not really able to you can't get to them from the inside, and so there's really no way you can really get to them and fix them, first of all. So they have to only use data, but there's only so much you can do before they actually have to bring the spacecraft home. And so out of abundance of safety, they've decided to just bring it home uncrewed. And they did have a contingency plan for this. There's always a plan. This is a test flight, unlike a standard space station operational mission. So there was a little bit more of background, apparently, plans for this in the case of this happening. So that's a good relief.
Yeah, Butch and Suni are going to spend the next 6 months up on the space station and essentially become a part of Crew 9 and eventually be brought home by Boeing's competitor, SpaceX, which has to be, I think, a black eye for Boeing, which we know is having problems both in its commercial aviation sector and now with this in its spacecraft sector. It's interesting. You mentioned how both Boeing and NASA were go to begin this third mission for Boeing Starliner, but the first with humans, both jointly agreeing that now is the time to try to launch these two test pilots into space, these two astronauts. I can only imagine the decision to leave them on the space station maybe wasn't as joint as that decision to launch, with NASA ultimately deciding that they were going to keep their crew members safely up on the ISS. I can only imagine what being a fly on the wall in that meeting would have been like.
I think, and it's been a bit since they had their last press conference on this that I was able to watch, but Starline, when they had the press conference announcing this, it was only NASA personnel on the panel, which is very unusual for SpaceX press conferences. I've been following the Starliner in general program since the beginning. I saw the first launch in Hilton Head downrange, and so that was they're lucky they got the capsule back on the first one, to be very frank. So yeah, this has definitely been a further black eye on the program.
Yeah, NASA had a news conference similar to the one you described just this past Wednesday. We had it on our Carolina Weather Group YouTube and audio podcast feed. And, that question was asked of the three NASA officials who were on the panel. Boeing was not there. And I would say in a lot of these press conferences, as I'm sure you've seen, Joseph, NASA is always polite, not very emotional, very just matter of fact. And I was kind of reading in between the lines when they were trying to say, it was our decision. We went to a meeting, and this is what we decided. Because ultimately, it's NASA who's responsible for the safety of the two astronauts. Because the context, of course, is that NASA, for a long time, had its space shuttle program. They did away with that, and they've shifted now to this private sector accommodations, with SpaceX essentially being their taxi service. They wanted Boeing to also be their taxi service for redundancy. And so it's NASA who's contracting. We need a lift up to the space station for these humans or for this cargo or whatever it may be. And so, I've had a couple people ask me today, and Joseph, you probably are in the same boat. Like, hey, what are the chances this thing safely lands in the desert in New Mexico tonight at midnight, like it's supposed to? And my answer's just been, well, not as high as NASA would have liked to feel comfortable enough to put humans on it.
I think it's likely. I think it's very likely it'll land. But they had thruster issues on the last flight, an uncrewed flight, right on deorbit, and they thought it was a one-off or not. It was the end of the mission anyway, because the service module burns up and they separate from the capsule right before landing. And so the other issue with this issue they're having right now with the thrusters is they're not going to get the components back. It's all going to re-enter. So it's not a great part to have fail, but at the same time, it's not endangering the crew at the moment since they have the station. But they had thruster blowout, which I'm not exactly sure it is, but I'm assuming it's just not correct usage of the thrusters, and it's a significant malfunction, I will say, though. On the last flight at the end, right before they separated it, the service module here at the end. So it has happened. So there have been.
Yeah. I thought you said about, some of this burning up during reentry is key too, because that was the storyline we were hearing at first. As the spacecraft was docked at the International Space Station and the delay was just beginning to be days before it became weeks, we just want to get some close-up views of the exterior of the spacecraft before we bring them home in it, because, some of that will burn up. And ultimately, I guess they decided, again, the decision to leave them up there. We do have a question right now live from the Carolina Weather Group YouTube channel. This is Brian Smith asking, will I be able to see this in the sky from just south of Greensboro? So unlike Joseph's story where he was able to see one of those earlier test missions, this one you will not be able to see. It is going to come in across the Pacific Ocean, over Baja, Mexico, over portions of Mexico, and ultimately landing in New Mexico. I got to tell you, Joseph, I'm still trying to get the word landing plays funny for me when it's kind of going to parachute down into the desert. I mean, I guess that is the word, but descent feels maybe more natural.
Yeah, I think also, it's worth noting that some of the most recent SpaceX flights You might remember, I think it might have been actually WNC with a report on the trunk coming off, which is on a SpaceX. It's on a SpaceX Dragon, which is the equivalent. This Dragon, the back trunk, had a piece of it re-enter and come down near Asheville, maybe like a year ago. And SpaceX re-entries used to come over the U.S. like the shuttle did. But because of that, they're also going to be coming over the Pacific. So future information for that is that even for people that are not in the Carolinas but are in, further west, it's going to be harder to see these reentries probably from now on out, from both the Boeing and the SpaceX side.
Yeah, that was a really good example, and how so close to home too, right? We're finding that piece up there. A little behind the scenes for folks here as we now pass the 11 o'clock Eastern hour. James Brierton in Charlotte, Joseph Niven there in Greensboro, North Carolina. This is the first live event we or NASA are bringing you since the demise of NASA TV. And that is relevant for one very important reason, because normally as we or other broadcast entities bring you this coverage, we get what's called a clean feed, where we can see what's happening at NASA, we can hear the comms, but we don't normally have to compete with their commentators or their video that they're rolling or their graphics. Well, I don't know if it's a problem on my end or a problem on NASA's end, but I'm having a hard time, Joseph, tuning in that clean feed. So what we are watching right now in our big box is the main NASA Plus broadcast that has their commentators on it, which means I got to ring up and down their volume. So we'll have to probably just listen in at times, Joseph, to find out exactly what's going on. Otherwise, we won't hear any of the comms.
Yeah, it's worth knowing right now what you're seeing is what was one of the shuttle flight rooms, control rooms. Now into a big screen where you can see where Starliner actually is over the Indian Ocean. So again, it changed right when you said it. So perfect example.
Right, perfect example of how we aren't in control of the video that we are relaying to you tonight. I'm going to see if we have any sort of alternatives. We used to get a downlink via satellite, and NASA has decided to discontinue that particular delivery method, and it's just making things a little bit trickier here tonight as we get used to that. We will tell you that the deorbit burn is scheduled for 11:17 p.m. Eastern time, so that's a little under 15 minutes from now, and then a landing at White Sands there in New Mexico at about 12 a.m. Eastern, give or take. That live map does show us, as Joseph just pointed out, where the uncrewed Boeing Starliner is right now. Uncrewed meaning there are no humans on board. And there you go. There's the mission control. I believe is that Houston there, Joseph?
Yeah, it's Houston. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I believe we now have, what was it? Was it 9 people up on the International Space Station? We have quite a few number of
it was a significant number.
And more coming.
Since one of the highest since the shuttle era. We're getting close to space shuttle era levels of people.
NASA's been really particular trying to get media outlets to stop running the headline, astronauts stranded in space. They're not stranded, NASA would say. They are safely on the International Space Station with a roof over their head and oxygen and food and water. I understand why they don't like the word stranded. But that wasn't plan A. But it was, as you mentioned, a contingency plan to have them stow up there at the space station.
And it has happened. It has happened before.
Yeah.
There's been multiple instances of this happening. One that comes to my mind is actually there's a guy, one of the cosmonauts in the 90s. It was the last Soviet, because when the Soviet Union fell, he was the last one that was still in space. He was kind of just left there. So there's been multiple instances of weird technical issues holding up crews. This is a little bit, we haven't had one like this in a while to this extent.
This would probably be also the first one I imagine in the age of private space race, right? You mentioned Soviets and our initial space race between the United States and what was then the Soviet Union, of course, later Russia. And now that we've turned the page into a private space race, SpaceX, Boeing, so many other companies that are out there right now trying to compete for government contracts or even private individuals. We're looking live right now at the Starliner landing site at White Sands, New Mexico. It is, of course, nighttime there, about 2-3 hours behind where we are on the eastern coast. I was wondering about this, Joseph, being that it's nighttime, we may or may not be able to get as clear a review had it been daytime. I'm thinking back to Orius Rex, was it, that they brought down in New Mexico? And that was during the day, and we could watch that parachute come on in.
I'm not completely sure. They might have spotlights, and they probably do. The SpaceX lands at night all the time out in the ocean. And so I'm not completely sure. And we usually get okay footage of that. So we haven't had one with crew. So it's going to be interesting from White Sands. This is actually, if they had crewed tonight land, it would have been the second crewed landing at White Sands.
That was going to be one of my questions for you as our go-to space expert here is, I'm so used to seeing, obviously, the shuttle landing, mostly at Kennedy, but some of its backup sites too. We've seen SpaceX in the more recent years splash down. Why is this one on land, parachuting onto hard surface?
It's supposed to, so SpaceX has made it a lot less of a problem, but they've had issues with saltwater corrosion in the reuse process of these capsules. And so they thought when it lands on land, and this is again a site when it was a backup site for the shuttle White Sands, and the shuttle landed, I think, early in the third space shuttle flight. They had to abort to a different landing site, and that was White Sands. But yeah, they think it's just a bit easier for reuse because these are reusable capsules. This capsule flew on the first Starliner flight, so this is the second flight. So that's mainly why, as far as I understand.
Just, it's so interesting as I'm still getting used to SpaceX, even as they are, we look now into Crew 9, which will launch, fingers crossed, later this month with only 2 astronauts, because then Butch and Suni will meld into that mission once they get up in space. It's so interesting to see how different companies design things, or even different government agencies design things. I think we have a launch next week from Russia as they continue to fly up to the International Space Station too. Let's take a brief listen in to the commentary from NASA, and we'll be back with you right here on the Carolina Weather Group.
They'll begin moving into place to watch Starliner make its final approach. And then once Starliner lands, teams will move closer in a very strategic way. They will first stop at about the 500-foot mark away from the spacecraft, and then they'll move in closer to the 150-foot mark while ground teams safe the vehicle.
That first team on site with Starliner will be what we call the Gold Team. They start recovery operations by performing what's called a sniff test, where they use sensors to check for hydrazine, one of the propellants that Starliner uses. They'll be wearing protective gear known as hazmat suits to prevent exposure to hypergolic propellants. Hydrazine is used as propellant, and if it turns into a vapor, it can be toxic. After the sniff test, they will notify the rest of the convoy when it's safe to approach, and then they're going to check the winds, make sure the entire landing and recovery team is staged uprange from the direction the wind is blowing for added protection.
Now, everyone out there is part of a different color team, and they wear a vest with that color, so it's very obvious who does what. So the next step is the Silver Team, and their first job is to ground the spacecraft. Starliner will be powered down, but there could be some residual electricity. So before anyone can touch it, they will ground it and discharge it.
Teams here on the ground are reporting that everything is getting into good configuration for the deorbit burn. That's now just about 6.5 minutes away. Going on with what we were saying, we also will have the blue team that documents everything that's going on at the landing site. These are photographers from both Boeing and NASA who have situational awareness cameras. And again, here's a current view of those teams all ready to deploy at landing.
Yeah, that's the holding site that we were mentioning, and then of course you can see the mountains there in the background in this black and white view. And the green.
Joseph, that is some very impressive night vision they've got out there in New Mexico. I'm glad they explained what it was we were looking at. This will help, I think, get us that view when Starliner comes down a little after midnight as we await that deorbit burn here in the next few minutes. Did you catch, Joseph, they were talking a little bit about, when the spacecraft comes down, the different crews that will go out there, they'll check for contaminants. But that whole conversation got me thinking a little bit about, had there been crew on board, the suits that they'd be wearing. In that news conference earlier this week, there was actually a question of what space suits do Butch and Suni have, the two astronauts who were intended to be a part of this mission, now that Butch and Suni are still up at the International Space Station. And it got into this whole sidebar about how Boeing suits and SpaceX suits are not compatible. So here you have American astronauts who are fulfilling similar missions, but all depending on which spacecraft they ride up, they get completely different spacesuits.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's some Americans that launch on the Russian Soyuz, and they have the Russian Sokol suit, which are very old school Russian suits. The Boeing Starliner, Butch and Suni, they have basically derived suits from the space shuttle program, and if anybody listening is an aviation person, it's descended from the SR-71 Blackbird suits. So there's a lot of old school lineage with new modern tech in the Starliner suits, and then the SpaceX suits are obviously new because it's SpaceX. And they will be bringing up new suits up with Crew 9, and they will their Boeing suits, I think, are still up there because they still have to have a contingency to come back down.
So I know one of the things they talked about, and I think they were hesitating to give us any visuals of this, but I was painting the own visual in my head. So now that Starliner has left, in case of an emergency aboard the International Space Station, had they need to evacuate, they're all going to be piling in to the Dragon that's up there. And that's going to be 6 of them in a spacecraft that comfortably sits 4. And they were talking about, I swear to you, the vision that I was getting in my head from this description, Joseph, was like, well, we found some straps and we found a milk carton and we stuck it on in there. And Butch and Suni will just strap on in case they needed to come on home. And I was like, that's not how I would want to fly home from space.
No, it's never the most ideal. There was the reason why everybody wears suits on landing is because there is a risk of depressurization, and that's why there was a fatal incident for the Russians back in the 60s not wearing suits, and they had depressurization on landing. And so basically everybody since then has put suits on, but obviously in an emergency like that, you want to just get down. And so I believe, obviously the Dragon was designed for 7 people. If you take all the cargo out, actually you could fit a whole rack of seats under the current 4. Probably cluttered, but you could.
It's interesting because I thought the same thing, how it was built to seat. You said 7. I had the number 8 in my head, but I'm going to go with your 7. And then there was all this talk, well, how do we get 6 people in there? And I'm thinking to myself, isn't the thing built to handle that many people? But I guess just like your minivans, it's how many of the rows do you have flipped down versus ready to go? Yeah,
and usually they pack a significant amount of cargo below their seats. And so that usually takes up pretty substantially. So even if they had to do an emergency, they would have to remove a lot. Like a minivan.
Quite literally like the minivan. We do know that the Starliner has some cargo coming back down. I don't remember too many of the specifics from the news conference, but they did put some things in Starliner to come back down that were either, completed science experiments. I imagine probably some non-vital things. And they also have the spacecraft full of sensors so they can kind of get measurements on what it would have been like as a human to fly on down. Just here in the next few minutes, the spacecraft will begin its deorbit before landing in New Mexico at midnight. Let's listen back into NASA commentary, and Joseph and I will be back in just a few moments with continuing coverage of the return of Boeing Starliner from the Carolina Weather Group.
Will be taking over cooling. They use water to cool the cabin. Starliner is also, as we said, now in the correct attitude for performing the deorbit burn, and at this point, the service module and crew capsule are still attached to each other. 4 of the service module's 12 aft-facing orbital maneuvering and attitude control engines are going to be powering the deorbit burn, allowing them to separate safely.
And those engines are each 1,500-pound thrusters, meaning this burn will take about 6,000 pounds of thrust, slowing Starliner from its current orbital velocity and bringing it back to Earth's atmosphere for a smooth landing. The small reaction control system, or RCS thrusters, assist here in holding Starliner in the correct attitude. During this test flight, our teams ran roughly 1 million computer model simulations showing all the different thruster combinations possible for a safe return to Earth today.
Just 20 seconds now until the burn starts. It'll last 59 seconds. And again, you be firing those orbital maneuvering and attitude control thrusters.
You are listening to commentary from NASA as we prepare for the deorbit
4
of
orbital
Starliner.
maneuvering and attitude control thrusters on Starliner's service module are now firing, slowing Starliner down as the capsule begins its journey back to Earth. This will take about 59 seconds to complete. We're hearing all thrusters firing well so far. You can see here those representation of those thrusters firing. Starliner's maintaining its attitude. And as those large orbital maneuvering thrusters are firing, smaller reaction control system thrusters are also working, keeping the spacecraft in the correct position for the burn. Still looking good.
Listening into NASA commentary as we await reaction from inside the room and insights
from the deorbit burn cut off successfully. Teams here on the ground reporting a good burn. Starliner is now on its way to White Sands Space Harbor in New Mexico, and a planned touchdown at about 11 p.m. Central, midnight Eastern Time.
Joseph, I know you were waiting on that data screen to come on up, and we did finally get it. What were you looking for on that screen once that deorbit began?
Yeah, I mean and you can see it on the on their left screen in mission control. You want to watch to make sure that all the thrusters are kind of firing evenly, and at the rates it wasn't wobbling, and that they weren't. You didn't have like a half of a thrusters fail off like significantly. Doesn't mean nothing happened, but like a major. Once, because if one of these side thrusters, whole things didn't work, it would start wobbling. It would start doing like this, maybe on landing. So just some stability that really shows that it's even thrust in general sense. So that's kind of it in layman's terms.
Yeah, and I think it's realistic to be optimistic, but say that's one of the things that in particular we were watching for with this deorbit and return to Earth is any sort of problem with the thrusters, given the historic troubleshooting we've had with the thrusters on these missions.
Yeah, and in fairness, that doesn't mean nothing was wrong. I mean, we don't know what we'll see. That NASA and Boeing will go and look at the data afterwards from this. The sensors are picking up that are being archived, and there could have been a problem. we don't know about it, or in most likeliness, it's been smooth sailing, as they say. But obviously, no showstoppers so far. But there could always be something that like it was off and more than they would love liked to. So
yeah, there'll be a lot of data certainly for them to pour over.
Right direction for the service module separation.
Okay, so their crews on the ground are reporting that
And
Starliner
service
is
module
looking
has
good
just
right now.
jettisoned, separated, and is now falling away. It will burn up during reentry over a remote part of the Pacific Ocean, and Starliner will continue on its path to New Mexico, where the landing and recovery team is waiting for touchdown. Starliner is now angling itself and its heat shield for reentry. The entry interface is coming up in just about 10 minutes. That's the hottest part of the reentry process, with Starliner's heat shield reaching about 3,000 degrees. To protect Starliner from those heat loads, the spacecraft has what's called an ablative heat shield. The outer surface of that shield heats up to a gas, which then carries the heat away from the crew module through convection. And our team calls this process a game of threes because during entry interface, the heat shield will handle those temperatures of about 3,000 degrees, but it will convert that heat to about 300 degrees with only 3 inches of ablator. And because of this protection during this hottest part of reentry, the inside of the spacecraft remains at about room temperature. When Starliner returned from its last 2 flights, the capsules landed with 2 black stripes up the sides, indicating the heat shield was ablated as intended. So we do expect to see that again today, and the team considers that a bit of a badge of honor.
A badge of honor. I'm sure there are lots of things they look for, lots of superstitions, lots of procedures, lots of habits, right? That go into to space flight. As we continue to look at live data displays right now, there's obviously no live video feeds, although I feel like SpaceX with their live cameras has spoiled us with the way we watch those booster rockets land back down. I don't know what Boeing has in store for us, if anything. Right now they're probably just laser focused on getting this thing back down level.
yeah, I mean, I actually like this better. I like the raw data. SpaceX doesn't give you all these, these data points as much as I would like, but
can you walk us through any of it? I mean, the only thing I, as a layman, recognize is the ball up in the top left, which I imagine would be like inside a cockpit of an airplane, just to help you find the horizon. What are you looking at here? Yeah, so
just as a disclaimer, I'm not an engineering person of any sort, but I can understand somewhat these just from experience. The spacecraft, as you see, is oriented for reentry. You'll see the heat shield is facing forward instead of the other way around for launch. So that's good. You'll notice the hatch. You can see a little bubble on the top of the spacecraft, which is the hatch that closes to protect the docking ring. On the first flight, they didn't have that, and that damaged, not dangerously or anything, but it got the docking thing a little cooked a little bit, so they probably do a little more of refurbishment. So that's just what I noticed. But in terms of data, you can see the altitude on the next to the you can see the altitude go down up the top left, kind of like an aircraft simulation. So that they're at 413, it looks like, thousand meters, and they're at Mach 23.5. It looks like. So the spacecraft is going very fast.
Yeah, certainly.
You'll notice at one point it was probably Mach 24, and you'll notice some astronauts, if you ever see them in their flight suits, they'll have a shuttle, little patch, or they'll have a Soyuz, they'll have a Dragon, and they'll have a little ribbon around it, and it'll say 25, and that's like a badge on there at Mach 25. So
we have a question from Ashley, who's watching with us here on Facebook. When will we see it? Will we hear it break the atmosphere? So we are expecting it to land there in New Mexico at about midnight. It's going to come in over the Pacific Ocean and over portions of Mexico before coming into New Mexico. So actually, depending on where you are, if you have a clear view in the sky, if you're in this portion of the world, you might be able to see it. I don't have any guidance here in particular, Joseph, about sound, but yeah, I would imagine if you're in this region, you'd be able to hear it. I don't expect to be able to see or hear anything from the Carolinas.
No, but in New Mexico, I mean, the shuttle famously when it landed, it made a sonic boom. On the SpaceX, the boom is what is actually the air being broken by the spacecraft. And you would have that on the SpaceX Falcon first stage Falcon 9s when they would come down. Ashley says she's in New Mexico. If you're near White Sands, you might hear it. You'd be really close. I can't know exactly how. It's coming in over the southwest part of the state of New Mexico. So maybe
so you got a chance, Ashley. You've got a chance to see or hear this. I do think, yes.
But you might see if you're what it depends. You might see it straight across, and if you have the ability to look southwest. If not, you might hear it if you're really close to White Sands. But I can't tell if it will be like multiple sonic booms. The space shuttle was twice. But I don't think Dragon is, and I don't think Starliner is. I think it might be one. But yes, I think it does.
We're excited for you, Ashley, too. Hopefully you stay with us and you let us know what it is that you see or hear. It sounds like you're about an hour drives away from White Sands, but by the way the crow flies or the way the spacecrafts fly, you might be close enough to see or hear something. We'll find out here together. This is a little bit of a new experience for all of us because, as Joseph mentioned, while this is the third test flight for Starliner, this craft has had adjustments. It's still relatively new. We are so used to seeing SpaceX splash down in the ocean that getting used to the New Mexico approach, getting used to the approach where it's more of the ocean and less over land, something that Joseph and both NASA officials have commented is about decreasing the odds of having any sort of impact on communities. We'll see exactly what this is like here in the next half an hour or so. Our friend Tim watching on Facebook, thank you for breaking it down. The NASA Plus commentators are using really big words, and I do appreciate. Joseph, you're like our live coverage pop-up edition. If you remember those like MTV nights where they would put the little pop-ups in the music video, that's kind of what's going on here. That might be a really dated reference, but hopefully.
No, I understand it. I'm one of the early Gen Z people. I was born in 01, so I get some. I used VHS when I was younger. Probably old by then, but
there you go. That's the qualifier. Being
I was on the line, I guess.
Yeah. I'll take a moment here as we have about half an hour before this. Lands in New Mexico. About a year ago, the Carolina Weather Group had a chance to go down to Kennedy Space Center ahead of a SpaceX flight. Different company, but the same mission from NASA to get people up to the International Space Station, where we are conducting science experiments to help humans across the globe increase their knowledge of how to live and explore space, eventually onto the moon and eventually onto Mars. And one of the things astronauts have been doing up at the International Space Station is growing plants to help them make their own sustainable food source. And when I was down at Kennedy Space Center last year, they brought us into their plant lab to show us some of the experiments that they conduct both here on the ground and up in space. Take a listen.
So we're in a lab now where they are doing experiments to simulate growing plants in space, because the longer the missions go and the further from Earth they go, the more dependent astronauts will be on growing their own food.
This can't be a crew-intensive activity. The crew is we're not devising our crew complements by sending up people who are botanists and farmers like the Martian did. You may see that Mars looks like it's at the end of the roadmap, but in actuality, because of the needs of the food system, it's really the first area we're working towards. Prepackaged food, currently, what we fly in the ISS begins to degrade in certain key nutrients after like 18 months. For Artemis, I can send the prepackaged food up there and we're good to go, no issues. But for a mission to Mars, that's potentially 2 to 3 years, maybe longer in duration, now I have to supplement that diet because certain key nutrients are starting to degrade.
So right now we're moving forward with some really cool plans. We're doing cucumbers and melons. So I think what's interesting is we'll be able to utilize the work that we do here to expand the amount of foods that are available to the astronauts to eat in the future, so that we can alleviate menu fatigue, because we don't want them to get tired of what they're eating.
Or engineer plants that have less inedible material, more fruit associated with them. So we're actually using more of the plants than what you would traditionally grow today.
One of the plant growth systems we have on ISS is called the Advanced Plant Habitat, or the APH. And the experiments that go on there are called the pH experiments. PH04 I didn't mention last time, but we grew peppers in the Advanced Plant Habitat. And then this one is going to be PH07.
Very cool.
And what we're using is technology, science carriers, sensors to help us identify what's going on inside the boxes. And then we develop hardware here in our makerspace, like 3D printing, fabrication, rapid prototyping, to make everything work. One of the features of this experiment is something that we haven't done yet, is collecting a sample from the root zone in microgravity. We use this growth media. It's called arsenite. It's the red clay that you see on baseball fields. And if you open the box in space, it'll float everywhere. So how do you get a root sample back to here? Well, one of our students came up with a pouring device that's 3D printed. We're using a thread on the actual lid. This screws in, and then a sample or a core comes out that holds the sample in it. Once the astronaut pulls it out, they put it into the -80 below freezer, and then we bring it back to Earth and do analysis with it. So it's really cool. I don't know much about the analysis, but I do know about the prototyping and the drawings and the 3D printing. So it's like where all microbiology and engineers and biology come together. This is it completely.
And if you want to add that special to your YouTube watch list, we've got the links down in our comments. You can watch it after tonight's live coverage of Boeing's Starliner return. Joseph, I look forward to one day re-editing that now we have new AI technologies to eliminate the really loud fans that were running in that room as they were trying to cool the room and try different airflows on the plants. That was the hardest of the audio down there. Kennedy was inside that botany lab.
I quite like it, actually. I think it gives good ambiance, but
it was a lot of ambiance for a guy trying to produce some videos. So again, that was down at Kennedy Space Center last year for SpaceX Crew 6 launch, which we were there in person for live coverage here on the Carolina Weather Group. But right now, tonight here on September 6, 2024, you're looking live at White Sands, New Mexico. This lovely night vision shot provided to us by NASA, where in just under half an hour, Boeing's Starliner will be returning without its crew, as it is completing its now third, right? Test mission up to space. This was the first with humans on board for launch. It was intended to be yes, right, partial, because we were intended to bring them back down, and that just certainly did not happen. You can join us in the comments on Facebook and YouTube if you're watching live. I'm James Brierton in Charlotte, Joseph Navin there in Greensboro as the Carolina Weather Group continues to track in. Let's listen into NASA and see the latest that they've got going on out there in New Mexico.
Down, first stopping at about the 500-foot mark, and then they'll get the go to move forward to the 150-foot mark, and then once the vehicle is considered safe, they will move in.
Joseph, it sounds like they are once again walking through the different crews that will go in first to deem the spacecraft safe before they would bring in any of the science recovery teams, any of the medical teams. We've seen this, of course, with SpaceX. Had there been crew on board, I imagine, for a Boeing landing, just like with a SpaceX splashdown, you'd probably have a doctor or somebody there to assist them, right? Because this is not only the first time that this spacecraft has experienced atmosphere in weeks, it's the first time the crew is going to have that Earth gravity too, if there had been, astronauts aboard.
I mean, if it had been like the first, like it was scheduled to be, it would only been like a week or so, maybe 8 days.
Heat shield is now
and
exposed and ready to begin experiencing the atmosphere again.
And so there would not have been as many effects on the astronauts as much as they will be when they come back. But they are, the groupings of vehicles are in different groups in terms of how, like, the hazmat crew goes first, then another support crew comes first, and so you might notice the commentators from NASA. You'll notice that they may be farther back, and you might not get cameras as early. It depends, because they're way back in the convoy, because the support people go first, and they might practice like there's people on board, and that's something you should look for. You can look for. They did it all on the last 2 flights, but because this was originally a staff crew and then it didn't, I'm not sure if it will or not. But they might have like a whole ramp they put up to it, like if people are going to get out. But we'll see.
We'll see how much of it they actually simulate. Yeah. We're going to pause here for just a moment and welcome in our viewers on WCNC Plus. This is live coverage of the return of Boeing's Starliner, the spacecraft undocking from the International Space Station just after the 6 p.m. Eastern hour earlier tonight on this Friday, and taking that 6-hour journey back here to Earth. In the next 25 minutes, just after midnight, we're expecting the spacecraft without any humans on board to land in New Mexico, completing this 3rd test mission of the partnership between NASA and Boeing. Boeing being one of NASA's private contractors that NASA works with the intention of getting astronauts to the International Space Station and back. This is a program that has been underway for several years following the conclusion of NASA's Space Shuttle program, as NASA turned the pages and went into a chapter where they were going to contract with private companies, SpaceX and Boeing among them, to shuttle, if I may use that word, astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Problems with the Boeing Starliner with regards to its thrusters, with regards to some helium leaks, ultimately led to an extended stay aboard the International Space Station for the 2 test pilots, the 2 NASA astronauts who were aboard when Boeing's Starliner launched. Those 2 astronauts still on the International Space Station this evening after NASA decided to keep them there for another 6 months. They will join Crew 9 and its mission aboard the orbiting laboratory. Of the 2 remaining astronauts on the Crew 9 mission will be launching later this month, beginning the formal 6-month period stay for that now team of 4 up there at the space station. But what we are here to do tonight is watch the return of Boeing's Starliner, long awaited, back here to planet Earth. As you are looking live at White Sands in New Mexico, you can see, as Joseph was just explaining to us, the many support resources from NASA and Boeing and other agencies there, as we were looking through a night vision camera. It is 3 hours behind there in New Mexico, where we are here on the East Coast. Luckily for us here in the Carolinas, NASA's giving us all the times in Eastern, so it is midnight that we are expecting the landing, and it'll be about 9 p.m. there at White Sands, New Mexico, as the Starliner landing site. Joseph, you were just talking through some of what we can expect, and some of what are just question marks, because we haven't really seen this rehearsed or staged enough time to know exactly who goes where when, but we can certainly be anxiously awaiting these feeds here in the next 20 minutes as Starliner will descend via parachute. What do you think the next thing that you're keeping your eye or your ear out for is?
I'm looking at a couple other feeds. I'm looking at, they're a little more technical. People that are engineers a lot frequently comment on them, and but I'm looking at that. I think soon they'll get more. Once it gets interface and gets into heating, that'll be significant. I'm also looking at on our screen when it's, unfortunately, they don't give us the media feed anymore or as much. So as you'll see, the spacecraft is getting closer and closer to White Sands Space Harbor, which is why it says on that map, it says WSSH. And so it's approaching it. And so on this chart, you see it's convenient because it's going to switch right now because this feed's ahead by a couple of seconds. But the next feed they're going to switch to is going to, it'll start showing it getting closer and closer to the site. There we go. In this chart here, and in the far left, you'll eventually see it start kind of racing up. It'll start highlighting as it does. That's kind of what I'm looking at.
Yeah, it's an impressive 208,000 meters above the ground right now, as you can look at some of that raw data, which I know you were excited to see, some of the raw data as NASA shares some of their screens with us.
Yeah, definitely. He says ground range. I'm assuming that's the range towards White Sands. So it's going down, and you can see altitude is also coming down. So, you know, it's getting real close to the atmosphere. Yeah.
We know some of you are watching here in the Carolinas, as you have found an interest in this story for one reason or another. We know we have our new friend Ashley, who is in New Mexico, who is about an hour drive away from the Starliner landing site, who maybe will get a glimpse of this shooting across the night sky, or maybe even hearing a sonic boom. You know, Joseph, we were talking about how, you know, the difference between a day landing and a night landing, you know, one of the benefits to a night landing is you'd be easier to spot that streaking across the sky, theoretically, at night than maybe you would during the day, where you have the brightness of the clouds in the sky. Here, you're going to have that contrast that might make it a little bit easier to spot, at least theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Actually, I will say it's actually better an hour before sunrise, or right at sunrise. Is actually for a launch is the best. I saw OFT-1, the first flight from Hilton, as I said earlier, and it was illuminated. The plume it makes, which you don't usually see, was illuminated by the sun rays because it was brighter up in the atmosphere than it was down here. And I mean, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It's like a natural aurora, kind of. And we could see the model here. We could see the booster separate, the first stage and the second stage ignite. You could literally see it kind of ignite and start really moving up northward fast, or not northward, uphill. So, yeah, I mean, definitely. And in this case, it will be small but bright, probably. Especially in New Mexico, I don't think White Sands is near anything significant, like huge. In terms of
it's probably not near anything intentionally.
Correct.
Right. And, you know, you also mentioned the sunrise and the sunset launches. You know, here in the Carolinas, comparatively speaking, you know, it's not a terribly long drive down to Florida, or even down to Virginia for Wallops if you want to be near a launch in person. But, you know, the sunrise and sunset launches from either one of those facilities are also ones that here in the Carolinas we can often sometimes see, as you mentioned, illuminating across the night sky because of just the way the Earth is curved and that visibility along our coast. Not a situation we're going to see, as we've mentioned, with tonight's landing, because it is going to be too far away from us here in the Carolinas to see it. So the best place to see it is right here on your smart TV, on your phone, wherever you are watching us right now, as we await about 15 minutes away from the landing of Boeing's Starliner, and we will bring it to you live when it happens. Let's listen into NASA real fast.
Entry, now less than 100 miles above the Earth and heading towards the Baja Peninsula. We'll be flying over that before landing in New Mexico. Just 17 minutes to go until landing.
17 more minutes as Joseph and I and you at home anxiously await the return of a spacecraft that was due back weeks ago, but got delayed as crews on the ground and in space attempted to figure out what was going on. I think one of the most interesting and memorable parts of this mission will be a non-serious thing that happened, but just kind of layered on to the complexities of an ongoing mission. But Joseph, I'm sure you saw the headlines about a week ago when Butch, one of the astronauts up in space, radioed down to say, hey guys, the Starliner is making a really weird sound. As the Starliner was still docked with the space station, it was making a kind of a pulsing wah, 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 wah sound, given the problems they've had with the spacecraft, given the concern to always want to prioritize safety. The ground crews began conducting an investigation into what could possibly be making that sound, and turned out to be something completely harmless, which was just audio feedback coming out of a speaker. But I could only imagine it was just like one more head scratch for this spacecraft.
I mean, that's surprising. I would have thought a fan, because they do have to fan, make sure the air is consistent throughout the vehicle, because you don't have, you just have to do it, make sure there's no CO2 buildup. They do have to put like little tubes. You'll see in the station, they'll put like tubing between different docking modules, so everything's kind of flowing. The air doesn't get stagnant. It's not like we might, like up here, I have a fan on, so my room is, it feels the air is moving around. But in the space station, you have to manually do that. I don't have a breeze going around. So that's why I thought it was originally. But it's funny, it was feedback.
It was just funny that it was something so innocent. Guys watching with us on Facebook says, should go right over my house. So glad you found us here, Guy. We welcome you in. Let us know what it is you see or hear. We're very interested to learn what you are witnessing tonight as we await the return of Starliner. And shout out also to Philip watching with us on YouTube. Cool. This channel is quite informative. Well, we appreciate that, Philip, and appreciate you watching along with us and for your comments so far as we look live at the Starliner landing site in White Sands, New Mexico, just under 15 minutes away. Joseph, you've been watching this mission, the previous Starliner missions, lots of space stuff for us here. What's going through your mind right now? What are you feeling? What are you thinking as we narrow down the last few minutes of this test mission?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely the longer duration, probably the longest duration Starliner flight so far, inadvertently. So that's interesting. But it shouldn't be a problem. It's just interesting.
Down by
off 1 second,
to a speed very similar to what you might experience while going down an elevator inside a high-rise building. The vehicle then comes to a safe, comfortable stop at landing.
I could hear them in the preview monitor talking about how folks in the area might hear a sonic boom. And I know that is a question that has come into our chat tonight, what people in New Mexico might be able to experience. So I'm sorry I cut you off, but as you and I have been speculating, I wanted to get it straight from NASA. And that was, in fact, what they were trying to tell people is, yes, you might hear a sonic boom.
And, SpaceX is becoming, and this says right now, they're reaching an entry interface out now on another feed I'm looking at. Boeing just tweeted. And they will lose communications for about 4 minutes. So that's why it's probably a little more quiet on the NASA feed, because they're just not getting as much interface, which is very normal. Sometimes if they have enough satellites above them, they can still get the feed for a longer period of time. But even the shuttle lost blackout. Basically, every capsule has had that. So.
Yeah, here's the tweet that you mentioned, or the post on X from Boeing's space account. So, we've been listening to commentary from NASA, and it's good to know that, Boeing, the joint partner with NASA on this. Again, to explain that relationship to folks who may not be so familiar, ever since NASA discontinued its space shuttle program, they have been contracting with companies, SpaceX and Boeing alike, to build these spacecraft and operate these spacecraft to get NASA astronauts and scientific equipment up into orbit, up into the International Space Station. And so that's why you've got a private company, Boeing, so heavily involved in a mission here that we're also getting information from NASA. So there's two parties involved here, and that is the world that we live in as NASA looks to privatize space, as other agencies, other governments worldwide look to privatize space. I mean, Joseph, we haven't mentioned tonight that the International Space Station itself, in the year 2030, give or take, going to be decommissioned, deorbited, burned up through the Earth's atmosphere, and then turned over to a new orbiting space lab or labs, which is expected to be, once again, run by private companies as we move into this next generation of spaceflight.
Yeah, it's a natural progression, in my opinion. But NASA really wants to do this more deep space, lunar, and eventually Mars, but in the near term, lunar exploration, and they kind of want, their idea is that they will pioneer kind of the lunar stuff. They'll kind of push that, and then because they're going to push the resources that way, then that kind of leaves a little bit of room for the private companies to come behind it. So that's kind of the idea behind it. The space station is getting old. I mean, it's been up there longer than I've been alive. So when that does happen, it'll be very weird.
The guy
Yes.
who still remembers using VHS tapes is still younger than the space station. Okay, all right, that helps us hone that in a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know why we had them in my basement, but we did. But yeah, so the space station launched in 99 or 98, around then. So about 2-3 years before I was born. So it's been out there for a while. Some of the modules are starting to have more and more problems. You might have seen news articles about small leaks in the past. So not bad leak, but there are a lot more problems starting to pop up because some of the modules are. I think some of them have been up there the longest.
We're coming to an end of lifespan. Yeah, let's take a listen at this as we bring the audio back up from NASA too. We saw some of the crew getting out of their vehicles there at White Sands.
This is a live view from the International Space Station where we're able to get a view of Starliner's track as it comes in. We are now less than 10 minutes away from landing at the White Sands Space Harbor, scheduled for 11 p.m. Central.
So, Joseph, excusing for a moment that it looks like any old camera you could buy at Costco. Is the Starliner path they mentioned? I guess that's the white line streaking across the screen.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't. There's some cause, and you'll see it now. Then it'll go to another feed. But it's called launch azimuth or inclination. It's kind of like the angle that the orbit's over, and that angle is. Because it had to launch to get to the ISS, it is in the same angle because it's just the less fuel. So that's why.
This camera angle I recognize. Yeah, I think
we're
both
WD-47.
Yeah, so this is on an aircraft in altitude, but it's actually.
This is a view from the WB-57, one of NASA's aircraft that is at the landing site, has been staged and ready to pick a Starliner or pick up the view of Starliner as it comes in, and that is what we are seeing now.
And they're filming this video from about 16,000 feet.
The WB-57 should continue to give us a view until the drogue parachutes deploy, and then we hope to pick it up with the Cessna that is also in the area.
So we're getting into the part of this now as we near landing where we're going to have some more camera angles from NASA, both on the ground,
and flight controllers
in the air,
in the room
and in
are
space.
reporting that we are out of that blackout period and everything is looking good. Starliner remaining nominal as she returns to Earth.
Philip watching on YouTube says, SpaceX will be the only hope for the new space station. And, I was just going to say that, the space station we have now is a great example of how companies who were once in a heated space race came together to build a joint lab. We hitch a ride with Russia. They hitch a ride with us from time to time, other countries involved too. So it was really interesting to see with this current space station how a lot of those countries came together. And I think it'll be interesting to see, Joseph, as we head into the privatized version of that, the relationship between these countries and what that looks like in the next generation.
Yeah, I think because of politics currently, there won't be a lot of. That's just my
fear.
Because there's, just my, studies and being, of everything. I think that is a nice view of Philip, but they probably won't be doing anything with Russia for the time being after the space station's gone, unless something changes. So that's something that's very likely that won't happen as much anymore.
It has been one of those safe spaces where the cooperation has been ongoing despite whatever else is happening in the political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, that's also because it's been a necessity, because the station was built that the control parts of the space station with the thrusters are on the Russian side, not on the American side, or the international side rather. So that makes it hard. You can't really separate them. It's kind of just built. So that's why Americans still launch on the Russian Soyuz, because that is just how it was built, and you can't really separate it. So that's why it's still that way.
This is a view from the Cessna aircraft that is in the area. NASA mentioning they have more than one aircraft right now, and they probably have some cameras on the ground too that we'll see when this gets a little bit closer. Again, the approach being that Starliner's coming in over the Pacific Ocean, over portions of Baja, Mexico, and other areas of the country of Mexico before coming into the United States and the state of New Mexico. That is the most number of times I think I've ever said Mexico in a sentence. And we're watching again as we are waiting for the uncrewed Boeing Starliner to land. Uncrewed meaning there are no astronauts on board, which was a deviation from the original plan, but not a deviation from any of the contingencies that NASA certainly had with any mission lengthy contingencies.
Because it is very dark out there.
And you might notice at this point it may not be creating a plume,
the landing site,
re-entry plume,
and just 5 minutes.
but it might be glowing because of the heat still on the infrared cameras, because it is still obviously very warm on the outside. So
yeah, especially as that atmosphere gets thicker, it'll have more to push through. It's always hard to imagine that the air itself and the particles that are in the air, dust, moisture, are all things that, and when you're moving at this speed, you certainly have to contend with. We've, I think, mentioned that the blackout period has come to an end. So we are, once again, getting data from the spacecraft as the service module being jettisoned some 35 minutes ago, Starliner angling for the re-entry, and now in its final minutes it comes into this final approach for landing in New Mexico.
All right, and that action you're seeing on your screen, forward heat shield and
chute
out.
went out. Yep.
Little
Really
mini
interesting
explosions
view
to
of
release
this,
those chutes.
Coming down from the WB-57. See those two drogue parachutes now deployed. They slow the vehicle down initially until it gets to a safe speed for the enormous main parachutes to follow.
It looks like the airbags might be inflating. They usually at some point drop the
About 4 minutes to go
heat
until
shield,
touchdown.
and then actually I don't think it has opened yet, but at some point you will see the heat shield actually come off the spacecraft,
Now
and then
back
the
to a view
airbags
from the
will
Cessna aircraft in
inflate.
the vicinity of the landing site. Again, this is a
Spacecraft
view
does
from
have a
lower
name.
than the WB-57 we're seeing.
It's named Calypso, like a shuttle had a name. This one does too, as is the SpaceX Dragons.
The 3 main parachutes come out, and everything will happen pretty quickly from that point on.
Live pictures from NASA, White Sands, New
After
Mexico.
those mains are out, we'll see the bottom heat shield that has been protecting Starliner through its journey through the atmosphere come off. That makes way for the landing airbags to deploy.
And there's the main
And the
parachutes
3
there on your
mains,
screen.
yeah.
We see 3 out, currently
That
reaching.
answers Philip's question. That comment coming in just before these main 3 chutes opened up.
And
Here
the
it
teams
does.
at the
Heat shield should be
landing
dropping.
recovery teams report that they heard the booms as those came out.
3 good mains fully open there. You can see Starliner in a slight tilt, so we're going to see the rotation handle move here shortly, and it will level out Starliner. But 3 good parachutes, looking great.
Just a little over 2 minutes until the expected landing time, and we heard the rotational handle has been released, so you can see that tilt evened out.
Looking nice and level there.
Heat shield jettison.
Yep. The heat shield should drop momentarily.
There it goes.
And there it goes.
And then the
And
airbags,
wait
those
for the
airbags
airbag
below,
inflation.
which will
Nice
inflate.
to see that. You can see the airbags deploying there on your screen. Those airbags are
It's
filled
good
with
to
hydrogen
understand
they guide
as you're
Starliner
explaining to
safely
us
back
what
to
we
the
are
desert
seeing,
floor.
so that we know it's something normal, it's something nominal when we see these little explosions happening to release certain parts of mechanisms.
Yeah, it is the only human-rated spacecraft that uses airbags. It's a very unique sequence. I mean, SpaceX doesn't do it, but it is a fairly hard landing.
Sight as Starliner makes its way
as far as
through
I
the
remember.
sands of New Mexico.
So not dangerously hard, but it is a jolt.
And flight
So
controllers confirming 6 good airbags.
it's not like an ocean where it kind of just comes down.
This view still coming to us from the Cessna. We've got just about a minute left to go until the expected touchdown. I'll be watching for that time for you.
James Barton in Charlotte, Joseph Niven in Greensboro, North Carolina, as we are watching this return of Boeing's Starliner, White Sands, New Mexico, here at this midnight hour now on the East Coast. Be curious to see those folks who've been chatting with us live tonight. Some of you tuning in from New Mexico, if you heard or saw this shooting across the night sky. Be curious to hear any of those observations on what may have been visible outside of this White Sands landing zone that we have set up here as we watch the aircraft
Just
decrease
about
its
15
speed
seconds
and
away
descend.
from expected touchdown. You're seeing the ground there in your screen as we get closer.
You'll notice when they get maybe more close-up footage of this capsule after landing that it has like a tile system on the sides of the spacecraft like the shuttle did. So it's kind of interesting. It's like an old school capsule, but with like a shuttle side of a heat shield, except the bottom heat shield, which dropped away. And it should be landing in a second. Getting pretty close to landing here.
I imagine it's pretty dark out there, but what a view we're getting from some of these night vision cameras.
There we
Touchdown.
go.
Starliner is back on Earth. That landing coming at 11:01 and 35 seconds Central Time, 10:01 and 31 seconds Mountain Time at White Sands Space Harbor at the U.S. Army's Missile Range in New Mexico.
Or 1201 if you're with us here on the East Coast. So a mission that has been troubled with thrusters and helium leaks, NASA deciding to keep the 2 crew that flew with Starliner to space up at the International Space Station here now with a successful landing of Boeing's Starliner. I'm sure there's lots of sighs of relief both at NASA and at Boeing. Joseph, what are you feeling? What are you thinking right now watching these images live?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually more interested in after the fact, if they determine anything else from the problem they had, because when you do the deorbit burn, that's a very significant burn on the spacecraft, and so, excuse me, it's midnight. It'd be very obvious. It'd be interesting to see the extra data on that. If there was a blowout, a thruster blowout, like the other flights, or it was a higher temperature on it that should have been, or et cetera, that they recorded. So it'll be very interesting to see. Maybe they do it tonight, but like in the next couple days, or if Boeing shares, I don't know if they will, but they may in the future at some other press conference. So.
Yeah, there'll be a news conference about 1:30 a.m. Eastern time where we might learn a little bit more information. Right now, you're looking at the initial chutes that helped slow Starliner before the main chutes opened up. Those initial chutes still working their way back down to the surface as NASA's continuing to collect data from their aircraft on exactly how each and every mechanism involved with Boeing's Starliner functions, and they of course have lots of data to review well beyond the 1:30 a.m. news conference that will be coming our way shortly, as they will be peering over all of this data ahead of what I'm sure both partners hope to be future Boeing Starliner missions up to the International Space Station in the years of the orbiting laboratory that remain, 2030 being the year where we expect the orbiting laboratory to come to an end, with SpaceX having already won the contract to deorbit the International Space Station. Let's listen back in.
Starliner has touched down with its main parachutes. Touchdown came at 11:01 p.m. Central Time. The team here in Mission Control will be working through some post-landing steps now.
Eventually, we'll see crews move in towards the spacecraft. As NASA's been telling us tonight, there'll be several different color-coded teams that go in with different missions and different objectives, whether they're checking the spacecraft or theoretically checking a crew that would have normally been there.
At its landing site in White Sands at Space Harbor. The landing and recovery teams will soon begin making its way out to them to begin recovering the spacecraft. Team here in Mission Control is polling right now to see if everybody is ready to power off the vehicle. That again is a step that the flight control team has taken over with the lack of crew on board.
At least it's upright, which is a good thing.
Once the spacecraft is powered down, they will be transitioning control of the spacecraft over to the landing and recovery team. And it's a little difficult to see in this shot, but there is a strobe light on Starliner that will help the teams follow it out there.
And you can see in a little bit on another feed. This one is delayed, but on another one I have, you'll see in a second, the convoy starting to roll out towards the spacecraft. Upright.
And the recovery team is on
see
the
there,
move,
there they go.
I think Leah Cheshire and Josh Barrett, our colleagues out there, may be able to give us one last update. Leah and Josh, can you hear us?
Great landing of Calypso. I don't think there could be a better birthday.
Obviously, we did have really a great show. We were able to see the cameras that you were watching too from the WB-57, from the Cessna, from the International Space Station. But
Leah, can I interrupt you?
Yes.
Concur. It's been a really amazing day.
We were hearing a bit from Space to Ground there, but I think they've concluded, unfortunately. We'll see if we can get a recording of that for folks listening at home. But Leah, go ahead with your update.
Yeah, sorry about that. Couldn't hear that one here. So, but here's
Suni, MCCH here. Rick just wanted to offer that he's got one more hour here.
Hey, it's his birthday here.
Yeah, and that's what counts. Yeah, it was a good landing. It's pretty awesome.
You guys are the best. You are the best.
Thank you.
Suni Williams there, offering a slightly early happy birthday to Flight Director Rick Hempling. He will be celebrating his birthday on September 7th, but technically in Houston, we're still a little less than an hour away from that. They are, of course, already on September 7th at the International Space Station. But Leah, if you were still with us, we'll still take that update if you can give it to us.
Yeah, so as I was saying, we got to see the capsule and the plasma trail coming up over the mountains from the southwest. And we were all still standing outside the convoy to watch that happen. But the most unexpected part was when I could hear the main parachutes being deployed. It was very faint, just a little bit of a rumble, but that strobe light really helped us identify Starliner as it was descending, and it would reflect a little bit up onto those parachutes. So we actually had a decent view as it was coming down under those chutes. And now we are actually on the drive out, and we can see the strobe light. It's giving us a great direction as we head toward the capsule.
Yeah, that's right. We are actually making our way down the former space shuttle runway, literally driving right down the middle of it. Starliner is a little bit towards the southern end, so we see that strobe kind of in the distance there. But we will make our way to the 500-foot mark, where Gold Team will move in and begin their assessments. And then once they declare that proximity operations can begin, the recovery ops will really get underway.
And with that, I think we were going to toss it back to you, Brandy and Lauren. If you don't hear it from us again tonight, just wanted to say thanks for letting us be part of the broadcast and give you the perspective of all the hardworking ground teams, both NASA and Boeing, out here at White Sands in New Mexico. So with that, sending it back over to Mission Control Houston.
Thanks so much, Josh and Leah. It's great to see Starliner home, and I envy you the up-close view, but we appreciate your updates.
I do too. Starliner Starliner has returned safely. Well done to the entire team for completing the mission with a successful undocking, deorbit, and landing.
All right, quite a lot of audio in the last few minutes as Joseph and I and you at home were listening in to commentary from NASA. We heard from flight directors. We heard from Suni Williams, the astronaut, left up there in space when NASA decided to bring the Starliner home without her and her fellow astronaut. And Joseph, we're taking it all into watching these convoys roll out. NASA's had a chance to give their last thoughts, and I want to give you a chance to give your last thoughts here too before we wrap up our live coverage.
Yeah, definitely. I think NASA might be actually wrapping up as well. Yeah, I think they, on another screen that's a little ahead might have actually wrapped up. But yeah, I mean, it's good. Yeah, there we go. That's very interesting that they wrapped up early. They don't usually do that early, but it'll be interesting. It's interesting in general that they brought it home and it still performed well, but it's still a sigh of relief that they brought it home on another spacecraft, just for the sake of safety. Hopefully they go through the data and figure out what was the reason for it. Yeah, another successful landing. It looks like it was fairly close to the convoy, which is good. But we'll just see what the follow-up is on the next couple flights, because we don't know now when the next Starliner 1 operational flight will happen because of these anomalies in this mission. So the aftermath in terms of follow-up on the schedule of crewed flights to the station will be interesting to see what NASA and Boeing decide based upon this mission, since all the objectives were obviously not met.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'll be curious to see what NASA and Boeing decide to do with the Starliner program. I'm sure they're going to move forward, but when is the question? And we will see a launch from Boeing's competitor SpaceX to bring up Crew 9 to the International Space Station, scheduled for later in this month, slightly delayed because of the decisions that were being made with the Starliner program. And that SpaceX Crew 9 mission only going up with 2 astronauts, as we mentioned, because the 2 Boeing Starliner astronauts still up in space. We're distinguishing between who's a Boeing and who's an astronaut with SpaceX, but that's not really the correct way to distinguish them. They're all NASA astronauts, but just trying to keep the seat assignment straight for you as we're talking about the different spacecraft. So we look forward to seeing what comes next with Boeing as Starliner operations, what comes next for the crewed 9 mission up to the International Space Station, and really just frankly what's next in the years ahead as we look towards the end of life for the space station and possibly, hopefully, fingers crossed, the return to the moon with the Artemis program. All of that in the years ahead as NASA looks to explore and expand human spaceflight further and further into space. But Joseph, really appreciate your expertise and your commentary tonight, helping us break down what it is we were seeing and hearing. Couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Happy to.
I'm James Brierton in Charlotte. We appreciate you watching along with us wherever you are watching from. Stay tuned and be sure to like and subscribe wherever it is that you are watching for continuing coverage of this and the other day's news and weather. For now, I will send you a adieu. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you again real soon.